pineal is a small organ in the brain. It's about the size of a pea. Um, and it has been known since ancient times. It's been known in the East, in particularly Indian medicine, Vedic medicine, for about 3,000 years. And Descartes, a French philosopher in the 1600s, described the pineal as the seat of the soul, or the seat of wisdom. This is something that is quoted in a few books, certainly was in the 1970s, 1980s. And even now, people will describe it, as I can show you in this book, which is 1984. It actually says right at the beginning, the pineal gland in mammals has had a checkered history. René Descartes is well known for his 17th century view that the pineal in man was the seat of the soul. Now, that is viewed as part of philosophy and not part of science, the way current science, the current scientific paradigms go. So this is not really taken very seriously. In the East, the pineal was described as the third eye. When you see people walking around with pottus, which are spots in their forehead, Indian people, Indian women in particular, this is a representation of the pineal. And the third eye was considered to be an eye for perceiving truth. Truth.
In the postmodernist world, where does that fit in?
Well, it doesn't fit in very well, does it? And certainly in the general, truth is the root of, I suppose, my search. And my search was looking for the truth about the pineal, as to what indeed does the pineal do. The reason I became particularly interested in the pineal is that I knew so little about it. And this is opposed to the pituitary, say, which is another little gland in the brain, which is about maybe 1.5 inches in front of the pineal, in the brain, also in the midline. And the pituitary used to be described as the master gland that controls all the other glands.
Right.
In fact, the pineal has a big influence on the pituitary.
But what does the pineal do?
The pineal produces melatonin.
Right.
That is something that was discovered in 1958. And up till then, throughout the early parts of this century and last century, the pineal was thought to be a vestige.
Like your appendix.
Like your appendix, a primitive remnant of animal brains.
Yet Descartes is saying it was the seat of the soul.
Yet Descartes was saying the seat of the soul.
So what was happening there at the time?
Well, there's something radically different between a vestige and a very important part of the brain. And what I found quite extraordinary is that when I studied at the University of Queensland in the 1970s, which is now 20 years after melatonin was discovered, melatonin wasn't mentioned to me once, which I found to be quite an extraordinary thing, if melatonin is in fact an important hormone.
Right. What does it do?
I subsequently found that there's a mounting body of evidence since the 1950s onwards to show that melatonin is in fact a very vital neurohormone and is found in almost all vertebrates, from fish upwards. It says, even over here, that the pineal has a long history. Fossils of jawless fish from the Silurian era, with 420 million years ago, show clearly defined those small pineal recesses in the center of the head. So there are a few mammals, such as sloths and armadillos, that apparently don't have pineals. Crocodiles don't have pineals. But even these animals do have melatonin. Other parts of the body can synthesize small amounts of melatonin. But the vast majority, or vast proportion of melatonin is produced in the pineal. And melatonin is produced from serotonin. You may have heard of serotonin because it's come to a certain amount of public knowledge about serotonin because Prozac affects serotonin. In fact, Prozac is one of a group of antidepressants called SSRI antidepressants, which are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they stop serotonin from being taken back up into the nerve endings, so serotonin levels will build up in areas of the brain. What the current textbooks fail to mention is that serotonin has a very high concentration in the pineal, and that serotonin is converted into melatonin in the pineal. This contrasts to books as early as 1965, which is a book on physiological chemistry, 1965, and this actually goes through the entire biosynthesis of melatonin.
In 1965.
This is 1965. So the idea that, so this is only 6 years after the discovery of melatonin in the first place.
Right, and prior to that, for some 300 or 400 years, it was considered vestigial or as a useless organ.
Well, yes. I mean, there weren't textbooks as such produced in the 1700s. So how much was, certainly from the time of Descartes onwards, I can't say that I have gone and read a whole lot of books from the 1700s to really know what was going on there. I do know that in the early part of the century, or this century, in fact through most of this century, the pineal has been viewed as being vestigial. So
Is that because it's a very contentious argument for someone like Descartes to say that a particular organ in the body is the seat of the soul, when the definition of the soul is a very contentious issue in Western psychology itself?
I think that that has a bearing on it. People talking about the soul, the conversations about the soul, were considered to be the premise of the church and not of science, or theology at least. Likewise, questions about truth was considered to be part of epistemology and part of philosophy and not part of mainstream science again. So it's to do with how the scientific paradigm has changed. And also science generally, certainly the early part of this century, there was a very much an opposition to concepts of soul at all. Simply because they were talking about the soul as opposed to soul. So rather than spiritual values, they were talking about the spirit as if it was a kind of an entity that was supposed to be stored inside the pineal, which of course doesn't make any sense. As to whether the pineal has some bearing, or correct pineal function, or healthy pineal function, has some bearing on whether one perceives truth. That's the sort of question that I was interested in looking at, which is, it is a question of philosophy, but it's tied in with science as well, and it's scientific philosophy. And certainly I think the philosophy of science is a very important area as to how much does science actually approach truth.
Especially as it relates to ethics and economics. What role has that played in the amount of information about the pineal gland?
I would suspect that economics has had a fair amount to play with it, in that Prozac, the profits for Eli Lilly from Prozac were $3 billion last year. That's a lot of money, and I'd have very little doubt that if Prozac affects serotonin levels, it must also have some effect on melatonin as well. As you know, melatonin is a very popular tablet or supplement. They're viewing something as a dietary supplement, but it's not really a dietary supplement, it's people taking a hormone. And people are taking melatonin for jet lag, for seasonal affective disorder.
So it helps their body clocks?
It helps their body clocks. The pineal is involved as your body clock, and that is something that is mentioned in, say, Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, 1980 edition, describes the biological clock and the role of the pineal in the biological clock and the timing of physiological events. It's also involved in the timing of puberty and sexual cycles generally. This is something that was mentioned again in this book, where they say that a French clinician, Dr. Hubner, must be given credit for linking the pineal gland with reproduction. He presented observations in 1898, which is now 100 years ago, on the case of a 4-year-old boy with precocious puberty, whom it was discovered had a pineal tumor.